watching The Pulse, your weekly guide to global health on Al Jazeera. I'm Shireen El-Feki. Consumption, the white plague. That's what they used to call tuberculosis, a deadly and virtually uncurable disease. Today, things are different. We now have drugs to tackle TB, but the problem is far from solved. That's because today's medicines are losing their punch against the bacteria which cause tuberculosis. And even these treatments are not the best for those who need them most in the developing world. So what's being done to get a grip on TB? The Pulse went to Peru and Korea to find out. A shantytown on the edge of the Peruvian capital, Lima. It's home to 4 million people. Most come from the countryside looking for a better life. Few find it, but many do find TB. Today, new lethal strains of TB are emerging. They're resistant to many current drugs, hence the name, multi-drug resistant, or MDR-TB. Jaime Bayona works for Socios en Salud, Partners in Health, a group on the ground in Lima trying to get treatment for people like Susana, affected by TB.
These families living in poor conditions suffer also of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Susana is a 57-year-old with 9 children. 5 of the children got multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. 4 of them died.
Worldwide, 9 million people develop TB every year. More than 1.5 million die of the disease. There are antibiotics to tackle TB, but patients have to take a combination of medicines for at least 6 months. Often it's difficult to stay the course, and this gives multi-drug resistant TB a chance to develop. 3/4 of MDR-TB cases are now super strains, resistant to 3 out of the 4 main drugs. These patients must take so-called second-line drugs for up to 2 years. They're 1,000 times more expensive than conventional treatment, and they are hard for patients to stomach. Until recently, there was little prospect of novel drugs to tackle TB. That's now changed, thanks to new partnerships between research centers, drug companies, and not-for-profit organizations, as well as new sources of funding. In 2000, there were only 2 new medicines for TB in the pipeline. Today, there are more than half a dozen clinical trials on the go, and hundreds more compounds being tested in the lab. In Korea, scientists are exploring a family of compounds known as quinolones, common and effective antibiotics. At the Korean Institute for Chemical Technology, or CRICT, they're developing a quinolone that will specifically target MDR-TB.
Generally, you make hundreds and hundreds of compounds and test those compounds and give you information, but let you know they're not going to make it. And also, you need to consider to make sure the drug is very affordable.
Koreans also suffer from TB. At the country's main TB hospital, over 1,000 patients are admitted every year, and over half of them have drug-resistant TB.
The patient cannot endure the full course of medication. So in other words, it's poor compliance. So if we develop a new drug, the less side effect and treatment period may be shorter. In that case, we can enhance the compliance. If I'm a TB patient, I'm not sure I can endure the whole course of medication.
The hunt for new drugs against resistant TB is making progress. CRICT has synthesized more than 200 new quinolones so far, and many look promising. Back in Lima, Susana and her 5 surviving children live in this small 2-bedroomed house.
The story of the 4 who died with MDR-TB is terrible because the treatment they need in order to be cured was not possible because we had lack of meds.
Susana has to take a fistful of pills and have a painful injection every day.
Susana is on treatment for about a year now. She's doing better and hopefully she's going to be cured. However, treating MDR-TB is not always successful with most of the patients. The cure rate was below 50%.
In the meantime, Susanna has to cope with the disease as best she can. With her son Hoel, she attends a therapy class. Hoel had to endure the full 2 years of MDR-TB treatment. He knows just how painful it is.
They came here with very short piece of hope for survive, but here they find others who actually are cured and bring them, more reason to live.
New drugs mean new hope against TB, but much more is needed, including better tools to diagnose the disease and a more effective vaccine. For $2 billion, the world could get a grip on drug-resistant TB over the next 2 years. It may sound like a lot of money, but it's a small price to pay to put one of the world's deadliest diseases to rest for good. Multi-drug-resistant TB is hard enough to deal with, but the latest form of drug-resistant TB, called XDR-TB, is a nightmare. It's tricky to diagnose and it's tough to treat. Now, XDR-TB has been found in almost 140 countries. One of the hardest hit places is KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Here, the death rate from XDR-TB is an astonishing 98%. Joining me to discuss this deadly outbreak is Salim Abdul Karim, who's Vice Chancellor of Research at University of KwaZulu-Natal. Salim, can you tell me, why is XDR-TB such a problem in your part of the world?
Well, the problem with resistance in tuberculosis is it's due to a failure to treat people adequately. Our cure rates from TB are something of the order of 60 to 70%. That means that we've got 30 to 40% of the patients who have only partially been treated for TB, and that's what leads to multi-drug resistant TB. And then a small proportion of those who are multi-drug resistant also become resistant to second-line TB drugs, and that's what's called XDR-TB.
Now, is it a question that they don't have access to the drugs in the first place, or they have access but they can't stick to the regimens?
Or it's a health service failure, in that what happens is that a TB patient is quite ill initially and is motivated to take their medication. By month 3 or 4, these drugs are they have quite an effect on the liver and it makes them feel sick. So they stop taking their medication because they are actually feeling better off the medication than on. So they only take about half of their medication. That's not good enough to treat TB.
Of course, you have an additional problem in South Africa, which is HIV. How does that complicate TB treatment and promote the rise of resistant TB?
Well, HIV does 3 things that really complicate our lives in managing TB. The first is that the forms of TB that are present are very different in the presence of HIV, where a lot of the TB is outside of the lungs and therefore very difficult to diagnose. The second is that patients who have TB have an exacerbated form, patients with HIV have an exacerbated form of TB, which has a very high mortality rate. In other words, those who are co-infected with TB and HIV die to a much higher extent than those with just TB or just HIV.
So it's like super TB.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's the fact that both these diseases impact on your immune system. And then the third problem that we've got is that when a patient has both these infections, we can't treat these 2 diseases together because the TB drugs that we give them interacts with the HIV drugs. So that's our problem.
As you said, the conventional drugs don't work. You have to move to second-line drugs. How effective are they?
Well, when we have a patient with multi-drug resistant, we go to second-line drugs. When we have XDR-TB, the second-line drugs don't work. So now we're left with very few drugs. In fact, most of the drugs that are active against patients who have XDR-TB are in fact TB drugs that we stopped using 20 years ago. And those, because we stopped using because they have side effects and so on, we're now bringing those drugs back and we're using those to treat XDR-TB patients.
Do you put patients in quarantine?
There's been a lot of debate about whether patients with XDR should be quarantined. And on the whole, I think the South African government's policy decision has been not to do so. And I think it's driven by recognition of the patient's rights, but also a concern that compulsory detention would lead to the disease going underground. And our big problem is, where would we even detain them? We would have to find dedicated XDR-TB hospitals, something we just don't have.
But you don't want to keep them in the hospitals because you have other TB patients, plus you have HIV patients as well.
Our hospitals are full of HIV patients. Put an XDR patient in that setting, you're going to spread it inside the hospital.
So what do you need to effectively tackle XDR-TB?
I think what we need to do is we need to go back to basics. We need to control TB. Controlling TB and getting our patients to finish their 6 months of medication is our highest priority. If we do that, we will sort out the rest of the consequences of the drug resistance.
Thank you, Salim.
Pleasure.
Coming up after the break, Asia's recent floods have subsided, but deadly viruses linger on.